The bitch fired me on a Thursday. Not just any Thursday. The Thursday our 18 million euro European partnership was hanging by a thread. Legal was scrambling to prevent a regulatory nightmare with the Financial Conduct Authority, and compliance was 2 signatures away from a breach that would make the FCA audit us into oblivion. But sure, let's toss the contracts manager, the one who wrote the indemnity language they're now praying will save them. Not next week, not quietly, but in a glass-walled conference room on George Street with half the Edinburgh fintech scene watching like it was premium entertainment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Name's Nathaniel Blackwood, 41 years old, though most days I feel older. Friends call me Nate, though after what happened, I'm not sure how many friends I have left in the business. I've spent more time with contract clauses than most people spend with their families, and frankly, the clauses have been more reliable. Back then, they called me the clause architect. Some said it with respect, others with an eye roll like I was the IT guy of legal, always there, always invisible, always somehow keeping the infrastructure from collapsing. My official title was Senior Contracts Manager, 13 years deep, at a fintech firm that looked like it was built on venture capital and ambition, but actually ran on bulletproof clauses and my obsessive attention to regulatory compliance. I didn't make noise. I made watertight agreements. I didn't play table tennis in the break room or network at innovation summits. I lived in the subsections and schedules. While other people flirted with regulatory disaster, I was over here threading liability needles like I was performing brain surgery. I loved it. No, really, I loved it. Give me a red pen, a 40-page draft from business development, and a cup of proper Scottish breakfast tea. I was happier than a Highland Terrier in a rabbit warren. And yeah, before we go deeper, if you've made it this far and you're one of the 90% of folks who listen to stories like this while checking Teams notifications or making dinner, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and toss us a like. Not for me, I've got my legal settlement sorted. But the team behind this, they rid every click like it's oxygen. Helps keep the stories coming. And trust me, you'll want to hear the rest of this one. Anyway, at work, I was the navy blazer in a room full of startup hoodies. Never flashy, never chaotic, just there. Dependable. I kept legal compliant, contracts bulletproof, and liability manageable. 3 things no one in our open plan office appreciated until everything started to burn. Victoria sure didn't. Victoria Ashford, the new COO. Waltzed in like she'd won the company in a tech accelerator pitch competition. She had that Silicon Valley swagger transplanted to Edinburgh, always speaking in startup acronyms, always circling back and parking issues until someone else solved them. And she despised legacy staff. You could see it in the way she'd say institutional knowledge like it was a terminal illness. I was legacy. That made me a problem. Not in the direct confrontation sense, but in the I know what you're doing and why it'll explode spectacularly kind of way. Victoria didn't want guardrails. She wanted yes men. She wanted to sign partnerships fast, flip vendor relationships like trading cards, and get quoted in TechCrunch before the 3rd quarter. Me? I wanted to read the bloody vendor clause that waived our rights to sue in case of IP theft. Call me old-fashioned. Before Victoria showed up, life was oddly peaceful. I'd start my day with a proper mug of Edinburgh roasted coffee and a spreadsheet of pending contracts. I liked the solitude of it, how every clause was a chess problem. Every deal a minefield I could diffuse with the right indemnity language. I spent years building a system where even if everyone around me lost their minds, the contracts wouldn't. I was the seatbelt in a car full of speed freaks. They didn't like that I pulled the emergency brake sometimes, but they were still breathing because of it. People forget, in companies like ours, the person who writes the rules quietly becomes the most dangerous person in the building. They just don't realize it until it's too late. Victoria blew in like a Red Bull hurricane with a media-trained smile and an MBA from somewhere expensive but unaccredited. First day, she parked in the CEO's reserved space, high-fived the receptionist like they were old university mates, and announced to the entire floor, "Time to scale this rocket ship vertically, people," which in her language meant cut the compliance checks, throw out the safety protocols, and pray we don't nosedive into an FCA investigation. You could practically hear the bandwidth buckle under her ego. She was charming in that fast-talking, spin you around and sign your mortgage away kind of way. She had that faux humble charisma that made graduates swoon and board members nod. The kind of person who ended every sentence with "makes sense." Like your understanding was part of her genius. She didn't just disregard legacy staff. She treated us like expired software. The second she found out I'd been here over a decade, she smiled like I'd just confessed to still using Internet Explorer. "I prefer fresh perspectives," she said once, teeth gleaming. "People who think differently." Which of course meant people who don't remember how we got audited by the FCA in 2019 for this exact bloody stunt. Within weeks, she'd started muscling through contracts like they were Tinder profiles. Business development loved her. Product worshipped her, and legal? Legal was being excluded from calls, pushed out of deal memos, and sent final drafts 10 minutes before signatures. It was like watching someone build a skyscraper without checking the foundation, except they were using fireworks instead of concrete. Then came the breaking point. A vendor contract landed on my desk retroactively, of course, and it didn't just raise red flags. It raised air raid sirens. It was a strategic licensing partnership with a fintech firm in Amsterdam that on paper looked brilliant. But buried in the boilerplate was language that directly violated our existing NDA with a major banking partner and could trigger mandatory disclosures under FCA regulations. That's not just bad. That's Financial Conduct Authority knocking down your door with jackboots bad. I flagged it carefully, professionally, sent a memo through legal channels, CC'd compliance, even tagged our usual risk consultant. I didn't shout. Didn't make it political. Just outlined the liability like I'd done 1,000 times before. 2 hours later, I was summoned to Victoria's office. Let me rephrase. I was summoned to her glass fishbowl throne room where she liked holding impromptu meetings like a reality show producer. The woman was practically allergic to privacy. I walked in, closed my folder, and sat down. She didn't offer tea. Just leaned against her standing desk, sipping something green and awful from a branded company tumbler. "You don't like the deal?" she said without looking at me. "It violates 3 standing agreements and would require disclosure to the FCA. We could be—" She held up a finger like she was silencing a child. "No one reads the fine print, darling. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like we were in some 1950s boardroom drama, and I should be grateful she even acknowledged my concern. My vision tunneled for a second, not from rage. I've had plenty of people underestimate me, but from the sheer blinding stupidity of the situation. You're not business development. You're not strategy. You're not even legal counsel," she went on, smile fading into smug. "You're support. Read the line item, stay in your lane." I could have exploded. I could have screamed, pulled out the documentation, dropped receipts like a courtroom drama, but I didn't. I nodded. Just a small, deliberate nod, because in that moment I knew something she didn't. Victoria thought she was piloting a rocket ship, but I'd spent the last 13 years quietly building the ejector seat, and she'd just strapped herself in. I spent that night staring at my bedroom ceiling, replaying her words like crime scene footage. "Stay in your lane. No one reads the fine print, darling." My jaw ached from clenching. Not because she'd insulted me, that part was expected, but because I knew what she was about to unleash on the company. And the board had no bloody clue. I wasn't just thinking about my job. I was thinking about the multi-million-pound lawsuits that were going to rip through this place like a chainsaw through tissue paper. So I followed protocol, because I am protocol. First, I drafted a compliance summary outlining the violations in that vendor contract. Cited every clause, every FCA disclosure risk, cross-referenced it with prior precedent. No emotion, no opinions, just pure risk analysis. Then I escalated it, CCing legal, compliance, even our internal risk management officer. Quietly. I didn't go full sirens blaring. I let the facts speak. And then I waited. 2 days passed. Radio silence. On the 3rd day, I got an invite. Subject line, contract alignment touch point. Harmless, boring. Victoria's executive assistant sent it like it was any other alignment meeting, except it was scheduled in the main conference room. The one with floor-to-ceiling glass. The one usually reserved for investor pitches and product launches. There were already people inside when I walked in. Victoria, obviously, arms folded like a prosecutor in Crown Court. 3 department heads pretending not to make eye contact. And the company solicitor, Beth, flipping through a manila folder like she'd rather be anywhere else. I stepped in, no handshake, no chair offered. Victoria didn't even wait for the door to close. "We're terminating your employment," she said like she was reading a weather report. Effective immediately. For breach of trust. "Breach of?" I began, confused more than angry. "You went outside your scope. You escalated confidential deal information. You're not a compliance officer. You're not a solicitor. You're support staff. You abused internal channels to undermine progress." I could feel every eye in the room looking for somewhere else to land. Even Beth stopped flipping pages. Then Victoria reached into the folder and yanked out a copy of my NDA, slammed it down like she was laying the ace of spades. "I'd remind you that this agreement includes confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions. Any further discussion of this issue outside approved channels will be seen as a violation, which, as you know, carries personal liability." She smiled like this was a poker hand and I was bluffing. like she'd just shut me up permanently. That's when I saw it. Not her NDA, my NDA. The one I'd written years ago, back when our then GC William Crawford asked me to revise our standard contract language for legal staff and senior contract managers to include whistleblower protections and indemnity triggers. Because we were dealing with sensitive regulatory issues and he wanted anyone raising red flags to be legally shielded. That was Clause 15C. I pulled a copy from my folder, not the one Victoria had, but mine, highlighted in yellow, years of revision notes in the margins. I slid it slowly across the glass table toward Beth. My finger tapped exactly where it mattered. Clause 15C, indemnity provision. In the event of termination coinciding with documented regulatory concern or protected compliance escalation, the company agrees to assume full legal liability and defense costs related to said termination. In perpetuity, no cap. Beth froze. You could see the moment it clicked. Her face went the color of skimmed milk. Victoria didn't understand. Not yet, so I turned to her, calm as Sunday service, and said, I didn't breach trust. I followed protocol. And now you've breached indemnity. She looked at Beth. Beth closed the folder like it was radioactive. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask for a box. I just walked out, one foot in front of the other, as the solicitor sat there with a document in her lap that now read like a legal grenade with the pin pulled. And Victoria? She still thought she'd won. I didn't slam doors. I didn't cry in the lift. I didn't pull a Jerry Maguire and shout about principles in front of the coffee machine. I walked out like I was going for lunch. Calm as a funeral director. There's a power in silence that loud people never understand. Security didn't even escort me. That was their first mistake. Back at my desk, I slid my chair in, unplugged my mouse, and opened my laptop, my device, company issued but personally assigned and legally accessible under my termination clause. I synced my Outlook to local storage, pulled every flagged memo I'd ever sent regarding contract violations, FCA risks, internal NDA breaches, and questionable revenue recognition language buried in third-party agreements. I wasn't stealing secrets. I was recovering the receipts of my own bloody work. 13 years of audits, red lines, and escalation emails. All time-stamped, all traceable, all sent through company channels. I didn't need screenshots. I had metadata. Then I shut the lid, walked out, and gave my badge to the security guard with a smile that probably haunted him for weeks. By the time I got home to my flat in Leith, my inbox was already filling with pings from ex-colleagues. The whispers had started. Why did Victoria look so nervous when you left? Beth looked like she'd seen a ghost. Did you write that NDA clause? I didn't respond. Let them stew. Instead, I made proper tea, powered up my desktop, and spent the next 6 hours organizing my archive. I created folders: indemnity, ignored escalations, risk-flagged contracts, FCA violations suspected, and retaliation. I cross-referenced contract timestamps with email alerts. Every time I'd raised a concern about dodgy vendor clauses or misrepresented partnership structures, I linked it to the contract language Victoria had fast-tracked. It was like mapping a crime scene with highlighters. And the pattern was disgusting. Victoria hadn't just ignored warnings. She'd deleted people from email threads, bypassed legal, and shoved contracts through under fabricated urgency. We'll lose the deal. This is how scale-ups move. Don't be the bottleneck. But the worst part? Beth had seen it all. Maybe not every email, but enough. She'd been looped in. She'd signed off. Her initials were on files where the risk assessment section was conveniently blank. I wasn't just going up against a bad COO. I was going up against a bad system that had finally started eating itself. The next morning, I got a cease and desist email. Well, technically it came from HR, but the language screamed Victoria. It said my behavior post-termination may constitute a violation of my NDA and demanded I cease any communication regarding internal company matters to outside parties. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Then I flagged the email, dropped it into the folder titled Retaliation, and made a note. Attempted suppression of whistleblower protections confirmed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Clause 15C had already activated. Their attempt to scare me into silence only built my case. From what I heard later, the panic started 3 days after I left. Legal called an emergency meeting. Beth didn't show. Victoria started snapping at people in hallways. The board sent a routine inquiry about pending contracts. People started asking why the entire new vendor pipeline was frozen. And somewhere in the background, my solicitor was sharpening her pen. Her name was Charlotte Reeves, and she didn't smile unless it was to bare teeth. Employment litigator by trade, velociraptor by temperament. I'd recommended her to our former GC years ago when a director tried to claim a junior analyst misunderstood what a closed-door meeting meant. Back then, she settled the case so fast it made HR dizzy, and the director vanished within a week. That's who I called. "Charlotte," I said. "It's time." There was no need to explain. She remembered me. She remembered the clause. We met at her office 2 days later in a conference room colder than Victoria's heart. I laid everything out. Email archive, flagged memos, contract discrepancies, the cease and desist. Her eyes scanned each page like a predator looking for soft tissue. Halfway through my summary, she held up a finger and said, "Stop talking. You've already won. Now we make them realize it." Together we drafted a pre-litigation letter. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a threat. It was surgical. Paragraph 1, Clause 15C verbatim. The indemnity trigger. The whistleblower alignment. The fact that they were now on the hook for my legal fees, their legal fees, and any damages, whether civil or regulatory. Paragraph 2, documentation of retaliation. Termination following protected escalation. Cease and desist attempt as intimidation. FCA level exposure. Paragraph 3, a cordial invitation to settle quietly before we notified the relevant regulatory bodies. We didn't send it to HR. We didn't send it to Victoria. We sent it to outside counsel, the firm representing the board. Because here's the thing about Victoria. She played checkers loudly, slamming pieces, declaring victory before the board was even set. I played chess. And the queen had finally come off the back rank. But I didn't stop there. That same day, I made a personal call, a casual industry update, as we used to call it in legal circles. I rang up Alexandra Martinez, a regulatory auditor I'd worked with on a prior third-party review. Sharp, ethical, and just curious enough to be useful. "Hey Alex," I said. "Quick question. What's the threshold again for a company needing to self-report contract violations related to FCA-covered partnerships?" There was a pause. She knew what I was doing. "I'd check the compliance handbook," she said slowly. "And maybe if I were you, send me something informal. I'll decide if it warrants follow-up." I sent her a neatly collated PDF packet within the hour. No accusations, just observations. Footnotes, flags. Victoria, meanwhile, still hadn't flinched. From what I heard, she thought the cease and desist had scared me off. Told the product team I was emotionally unstable. Smirked in a strategy call when someone mentioned legal being overwhelmed. Said the board backed her vision. Then Charlotte's letter arrived on the desk of the board's legal representatives. It was like dropping a dead rat on a dinner plate. Within 48 hours, our old outside counsel, a heavy-hitting magic circle firm with an allergy to bad PR, reached out to Victoria. Not with questions. With silence, deliberate silence. The kind that fills a room like smoke before a fire alarm. Because the moment the board's solicitors confirmed Clause 15C was real and enforceable, and that all my communications were documented, traceable, and backed by regulatory precedent, Victoria became a liability. They didn't call me. They didn't need to. Charlotte got the message first. "We are reviewing the matter internally. Please refrain from formal escalation until we've had time to assess." Translation: we believe you. We are terrified. Please give us a moment to deal with our idiot problem. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't gloat. I brewed a fresh pot of tea, pulled up the vendor contracts Victoria had steamrolled through, and began drafting a new timeline. Because this wasn't revenge. This was architecture. A careful demolition of someone who thought rules were optional, and I was just a speed bump. Empowerment doesn't come from shouting. It comes from silence so sharp it makes people bleed. They called it a closed strategic session, but everyone in that building knew what it really was. A panic meeting. No agenda, no minutes, no catered lunch, which for our board was like holding mass without wine. Just 7 grim-faced directors, outside counsel dialing in with voices like undertakers, and a stack of papers 2 inches thick labeled Risk Profile Immediate Exposure. Victoria wasn't invited. That alone set off alarm bells across the company. She found out when her badge wouldn't open the executive floor, stormed down to legal like a child locked out of her own birthday party demanding answers. No one gave her any. Beth had retreated into convenient annual leave. HR was suddenly unavailable. Even her executive assistant called in sick. Upstairs, the storm was forming quietly. The solicitor began her presentation with a deep breath and no pleasantries. "We've received a pre-litigation notification from a former employee. The central issue is Clause 15C of his NDA. They all flipped to it. Most of them had never read that far. NDA clauses are usually fluff non-competes, confidentiality, boilerplate scare tactics. But Clause 15C wasn't fluff. It was a legal landmine buried under 10 years of compliance foresight. She read it aloud. "In the event of involuntary termination following a documented compliance-related escalation, The company shall indemnify the employee for all legal expenses incurred in defense and counteraction, inclusive of damages, with no financial cap, time limit, or exemption of liability. She paused. This clause was drafted internally by the former employee at the request of then GC William Crawford. It was reviewed by prior outside counsel and incorporated into 5 NDAs for specific staff considered mission-critical to compliance infrastructure. And then, because the gods have a sense of humor, she flipped the page. There's more. The employee has initiated communication with at least one regulatory body. He has evidence that his termination followed a protected escalation regarding FCA violation risk. She let that hang, meaning if I sued, the company footed the bill, both mine and theirs. If I reported, the FCA might not knock. They might break the bloody door down. The directors stared at the table like it might give them a different ending. One cleared his throat. What's the exposure? Unlimited, counsel said. Financially, reputationally, legally. He has documentation. His work is time-stamped. The clause is airtight. And the executive responsible for his termination had full access to both his NDA and his prior memos. There's no plausible deniability here. Can we settle? Someone whispered. We're trying, she replied. But he hasn't made demands. He hasn't responded. He's just waiting. They all went still. Because in business, silence is the scariest sound of all. And down in her office, Victoria was pacing like a caged tiger, still thinking this was about ego, about politics, about a disgruntled staffer too scared to fight. She didn't know they'd just reviewed a clause she'd signed off on, thinking it was standard NDA language. Didn't know the indemnity meant I could sue them into bankruptcy on their own dime. Didn't know the board now saw her less like a visionary and more like an active volcano. No one yelled, no one cried. But in that quiet carpeted room with its leather chairs and filtered water, something changed. They realized they hadn't just fired a contracts manager. They'd lit a fuse. And now they were hearing the first hiss of flame. It came in a cream envelope delivered by courier, like a wedding invitation from someone who hopes you forgot they stole your dog. A letter offering me a generous consulting severance package. 3 months' pay, assigned NDA, even promised to explore future collaboration opportunities if I'd just agree to move on quietly. They even had the gall to call it a gesture of goodwill. Charlotte read it over, chuckled once, and slid it back across the table like it was covered in bedbugs. They still don't get it, she said. This isn't a negotiation. It's a funeral. They just haven't picked the casket yet. I declined. No drama, no counteroffer, no angry reply. I simply ignored it. Instead, I compiled one final document, the memo. I took my original termination notice, highlighted the timeline of events, attached the flag contract, my escalation emails, the cease and desist, and Clause 15C. Then I added a cover sheet, submitted in good faith under federal and state compliance protections. For review, I didn't even sign my name at the bottom. I let the facts do the talking. Then I hit send. 1 email to the FCA, 1 to the Financial Ombudsman Service, and 1 to Alexandra, my auditor contact, who replied 2 hours later with, bloody hell. Buckle up. Back at the firm, silence gave way to chaos. Legal initiated a quiet but furious review of every contract Victoria had steamrolled through since her arrival. A compliance pulse check, they called it. A internal communications audit, they said. But behind the scenes, it was a full-on forensic audit. They reopened vendor agreements, subpoenaed Slack logs, and yanked business development into one-on-one interviews faster than you can say exposure risk. Word spread fast. New deal flow frozen. Clients nervous. One of our biggest enterprise partners sent an email titled Re-Governance Concerns and copied half the C-suite. Another delayed a £7 million renewal pending clarity. Whispers turned into meetings. Meetings turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into panicked back-channel texts between board members asking what the hell else Victoria had signed. Victoria herself was still putting on a show, smiling in Zooms, making half-baked jokes about red tape strangling innovation. But the glint in her eye was gone. She looked tired, smaller, like someone who'd finally realized the hole wasn't a pothole. It was a sinkhole. And me? I didn't show up. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post a LinkedIn essay about resilience or finding new beginnings. I just brewed tea, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the cracks spread. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was what it feels like when the house you built starts pushing back. Because I wasn't the clause architect anymore. I was the consequence. It hit the wire on a Monday morning, perfect timing to destroy the week before it started. No beline, no direct quotes. just a surgical exposé published by an industry outlet known for burying companies in polite, devastating prose. Headline: COO fast-tracks risky contracts as legal retaliation ensues. The article read like it was written by someone with a direct line to my email archive, which of course it wasn't. I'd never spoken to a reporter. Didn't have to. The evidence had legs. Someone, somewhere in the regulatory ecosystem, maybe Alexandra, maybe someone in the compliance office, tired of covering for cowboys, had decided it was time for sunlight. The piece outlined everything with brutal elegance. A pattern of reckless vendor contracts signed without full legal review. An internal whistleblower raising red flags, then mysteriously terminated. A previously unseen indemnity clause triggering massive internal liability. Regulatory interest now formally engaged per unnamed sources. They didn't use my name. They didn't need to. Inside the office, panic bloomed like mold in a damp basement. Teams canceled meetings. Executives stopped replying to emails. Legal locked down internal document access for containment purposes. Business development went full mute. And then the domino fell. A respected compliance watchdog, one of those slow-moving, methodical groups whose opinion carries the weight of a high court ruling in the corporate world, issued a rare public bulletin. A dry, heavily footnoted case study titled Retaliation, Red Flags, and the Cost of Ignoring Internal Compliance. Page 2. This case sets a precedent for how termination following documented compliance escalation may trigger binding indemnity clauses and potential FCA exposure. There it was, in ink. In the public record. Not just validation canonization. Victoria made it 2 more days. The board issued a statement. Short, cold, lethal. Effective immediately, the chief operating officer has been suspended pending internal review. Her access was revoked within the hour. Door badge, company Slack, admin privileges gone. She showed up that morning wearing her usual smug blazer and was turned away by security like she was trying to crash a wedding. People said she screamed in the lobby. Others said she just stood there, dumbfounded, holding a paper coffee cup while the badge reader blinked red. Me, I was reading the bulletin over breakfast. No victory dance, no gloating. Because it was never about watching her fall. It was about making sure people like her couldn't climb again. After that article, I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to appear. I didn't need to exist. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. I'd become the story you whisper at conferences. The quiet clause you double-check before signing. The ghost in the machine who reminded them compliance isn't optional. It's a countdown. They say you can't hear a career die. That's a lie. You can hear it in the squeal of glass doors swinging open harder than necessary. In the sharp click of overpriced heels stomping across boardroom tiles. In the quiver of someone's voice when the confidence starts cracking and the room doesn't flinch. Victoria stormed into the boardroom like she was still in charge. Eyes bloodshot, blazer untucked in that tech bro I'm too busy to care way. Waving a printed copy of the leaked article like it was a smoking gun instead of her own gravestone. "This is bollocks," she barked. "You people are letting him destroy everything we built." Silence, no one looked up. The board sat in still formation, hands folded, eyes forward like churchgoers listening to a sermon they already knew the ending to. Outside counsel was present. So was the general counsel, seated at the end of the table like a high priest waiting to deliver last rites. Someone inside leaked this. Probably Bethel, maybe even that memo-obsessed wanker you all fired. I warned you he was poison. He's been plotting this for months. Still no one moved. Then the general counsel spoke, voice like ice sliding off a blade. "We're not here to discuss leaks. We're here to review exposure." He opened a folder. Thick, heavy, familiar. My NDA, the one Victoria had thrown at me like it was a sword. The one I'd written, clause by clause, line by line, years ago in a different office under a different GC to protect the company from itself. He slid the contract across the table toward Victoria. One hand, no rush. Open to clause 15C, highlighted. Here's the clause you invoked when you terminated him for breach of trust. Victoria leaned over it, eyes scanning like she was just now realizing it wasn't written in her language. "You didn't just fire him," the general counsel said, voice low and exact. "You gave him unlimited funding to destroy us. On our dime." Silence again. But this time it screamed. Victoria's face drained. You could see the exact second it registered. Clause 15C wasn't a footnote. It was a warhead. All those emails, all those memos, every ignored escalation, every cover-up, every deal she'd forced through like a toddler with a hammer, all of it, was now legally tied to an indemnity trigger with no cap. The board didn't need to debate. One of them simply said, "Let's vote." No discussion, just 5 hands raised. Then 6, then 7. Terminated for cause. Effective immediately. No severance, no vesting, no shield. The general counsel nodded toward security, already waiting outside. Victoria tried to speak, but no one cared. The door shut behind her with a soft hiss that sounded a hell of a lot like justice. I didn't find out from the press, or a friend, or a board leak. I found out from Charlotte. She emailed me a single screenshot. The board's internal vote tally, black and white, time-stamped and signed. No greeting, no commentary. Just the subject line, Clause 15C, delivered. I stared at it for a long time. Not smiling, not crying. Just still, because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about writing a clause so precise, so quiet, and so deadly that it sat in the background like a coiled viper until someone foolish enough stepped on it. And now that viper had teeth. And a body count. The settlement came 6 weeks later. £2.3 million, all legal fees covered, and a reference letter that read like a love song. But the real victory? The new industry standard. Companies across Edinburgh, hell, across the UK started reviewing their compliance clauses. Started asking the quiet question, who else has been protecting us that we didn't even know about? They called it the Blackwood precedent in legal circles. A case study in what happens when you underestimate institutional knowledge. Victoria, last I heard, she was consulting for startups in Berlin. Smaller companies. Smaller stage. Smaller chance to do real damage. And me? I'm still here. Still writing clauses. Still reading the fine print. Still making sure that when the next Victoria comes along, she'll find the viper waiting. Because some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some people need to learn them more than once. If you enjoyed this story of strategic revenge and legal justice, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about Nathaniel's approach. Was it justified? Too harsh or absolutely perfect? And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to get alerts about more stories like this one workplace drama, revenge tales, and justice served cold. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.